Greetings, intrepid listeners. Adorable, cuddly, humble, and fierce September 6er Paul Toscano generously agreed to team up with me to bring you a bumper Christmas hamper of brain food. On each of the 12 days of Christmas, Mormonism's little helpers will deliver to you a conversation about one of the big ideas or controversies in the theology of Mormonism. In my opinion, you are never stupid to have found the big ideas in this religion interesting, inspiring, and a launching point or guide by the side as you consider for yourself what on earth is the meaning and purpose of life, the universe, and everything. Is there a God? What kind of a person is a God? What does that God want from us or for us? Does Christianity or Mormonism have anything useful to say about this, or is it all a big distraction? Are their doctrines mind expanding or thought stopping? Since we can't get intellectually and spiritually fed on their starvation rations, we have to look elsewhere to have these conversations. And wonderfully, there have always been heroes like Paul Toscano willing to keep up the fight for making Mormonism much more interesting again, or Mamma Mia for short. Undaunted by betrayals, persecution, excommunication, and skepticism, he has fought the good fight, published the books, perambulated the podcasts, and kept fanning the flickering flame of hope that the better ideas in Joseph Smith's theology could make Christianity healthier and more rational, and that the Mormon religion could still stop ignoring or breaking the treasures it has inherited. It was a very rare privilege to chew on some of these big ideas with Paul and hear about some of his first-hand interactions and experiences trying to persuade the prophets and apostles of LDS Mormonism to raise their game. As always, Mormon civil war is not just about robust and valid critical analysis of why the church we love is spiraling down a plug hole towards oblivion, but also offering pathways out of that early grave. In these conversations, we grapple with the most fundamental concepts that would have to be resolved of all regarding things like the 5 or 6 different versions of the Godhead that LDS Mormonism has been running with, and what Jesus' atonement and grisly death was actually accomplishing. Brace yourselves. It's Christmas. I'm going to sing. On the 6th day of Christmas, Paul Toscano said to me, mystics, prophets, and managers, scriptures as visionary text, revelation, insight to theophany, imagination versus fantasy, idealism versus physicalism, and Mormonism versus Christianity. All right, welcome back, everyone. This is episode 6 of our 12 Days of Christmas, brain food for the Mormon curious and intellectual, or people who'd like to understand a bit more about deep doctrines in our religion and theology and what it actually means to have these kinds of conversations. We've got my amazing guest, Paul Toscano, who is one of the leading thinkers within Mormonism about this. And it's been a real privilege already to listen to his thoughts and the things he's chewed on and learnt. And the more, we listen, things that at first seem a bit weird or non-Mormon or out there, they start to make sense. We can come to a point of understanding where Paul's coming from and how it's relevant to us and our relationship with Mormonism. And I just want to promote that as an encouragement that there is no field of knowledge, particularly in theology, which can seem some of the most woo and obscure and difficult things to grapple with, that you can't learn to do. Learn some basic concepts, listen to some philosophers speaking, look up what the words mean, find out who these thinkers were and what their big ideas are that we're quoting. And it all comes alive for you. It becomes something you can have knowledge and discussions about, even as a quite young person. And you are the inheritor of a history of thousands of years of human thought And it's a real shame if we go through our lives never being touched by that, never encountering it, never joining in, taking things forward or finding application in our lives as they are now from this world of theology, of doctrine, of philosophy. So it's been a real privilege to sit at the feet of a master of this, certainly within the Mormon context, and explore ideas. So our theme today is going to be one of my favorites, which is mystics, prophets, or managers. And I've already mentioned that for me, one of the great moments of teaching and speaking truth to power that occurred in Mormon history was Hugh Nibley's, I think 1983 or something like that, valedictory leaving address to, I think it was a commencement he was speaking at rather than like the end of term thing, to Brigham Young University faculty and students, in a speech that got titled Leaders and Managers, in which he basically warned that religion becomes an oppressive bureaucracy if you allow business managers and lawyers to become its leaders, and that their values are lying and deceiving people as a lawyer effectively, or manipulating and controlling information. And for business people, the profit motive is success. And tragically, we're absolutely seeing that play out now, that the most common professions among the LDS General Authorities and Apostles is business management graduates and lawyers. And hey presto, they consider it a raging success if they can be economical with the truth and manipulate people in the curriculum and their speeches. You see that little curl of a smile in the corner of Dallin Oaks, the lawyer's mouth, when he bamboozles people and he knows he's getting away with it. And where they think making potloads of money with Ensign Peak means they're doing great leadership, and say ludicrous things that literally contradict Jesus, which they did when the whistleblower kind of blew the lid on it all. And you had literally the presiding bishopric and the first presidency of the church being interviewed or releasing press statements in which they said they were following the parable of the talents, which they interpreted as you're meant to hoard money and make a profit in the marketplace in order to please God. And it was such a watershed moment for me, because it's like, they are that stupid, aren't they? They literally don't know that this is a metaphor for you put goodness out there in the world and it exponentially grows, like a financial investment. They literally think that you're meant to make a profit out of religion, and that's the message. And you just after it, and they kept saying it. And then the presiding bishopric said the reason they're hoarding the money in the stock market is for the next financial crash, like the Wall Street crash, in which all of their stocks would become worthless overnight, which is what happens. But they think by putting your tithing billions into the stock market ready for the next one, that's how you prepare to avoid the harm of it. These people are so dumb. Like, you couldn't even make up the level of stupid these people are. And you then have to ask serious questions. How did they get power in this organization? Why are they running the church's religion and money? And then, well, we can definitely do better. So let's see what we'd come up with if it was up to us to decide what matters in this religion. Because for them, it's money and thought control and lying. I think we can do better. So let's have a go at it, Paul. So our theme today is to do with leadership, really. Are they mystics? Are they prophets? Are they managers? Do you have to be all three? Let's get stuck in. What do you think?
Well, I think first of all, I want to make a statement, and then I want to make an objection to what you've said slightly. It's not a strong objection, but a little. First of all, I want you to know that I would have never thought these things that I think now without being married to my wife. Margaret is probably one of the best theologian in the church. And very close to her is her sister, Janice, both
Who
of
also
whom were
got
excommunicated. Janice
Yes.
Allred, her sister
Yeah.
Janice. And Margaret, in 1984, gave a speech at Sunstone, which was called the missing rib, the forgotten place of queens and priestesses in the establishment of Zion. And she was the first historian theologian to show that Joseph Smith promised to make the women in the Female Relief Society of Nauvoo a kingdom of priestesses, and that they would be on an equal footing with the great big elders, he said. And they would have the power to heal the sick and give blessings just like the men. And he said they was going to prepare them for the temple ritual where they would get this priesthood. And it would be a messianic priesthood that would be equal to what the men would get, separate from the corporation of the church. And so she gave that speech. I was home taking care of the little girls. And I got a babysitter the next day because they asked Margaret to give it the next day at Sunstone. She got a standing ovation. Everybody wanted it. They had to make a bigger room. They got everybody in there. You can find it online by looking up. It was in Sunstone. It was magazine. It was printed there. It was a pivotal statement. And over the years, I mean, she and I have had many great conversations over the years. We've been married since 1978. So how long is that? 44 years or 46 years? Like, my math is terrible. And in that time, in talking to her, she has refined a lot of my thinking. I tend to not be a black and white thinker, but I tend to express myself in ways that are not particularly nuanced. And so I wanted to say that a lot of the ideas that I express here are ideas that I've had because of her, but I wouldn't want to say that they're her ideas, because if she were here, she would express them probably better than I have them in more nuanced ways. The objection I have to what you're saying is I do not blame the lawyers and the accountants of the church for Ensign Peak. They are merely servicing their client, which is the First Presidency.
Oh, yeah.
And the First Presidency
and
the senior apostles, and to the extent they're complicit, the junior apostles, are entirely responsible for the downward slurge of Mormonism from the days of Joseph Smith to where we are today, where Russell M. Nelson feels absolutely no compunction about throwing all the previous prophets under the bus who've used the term Mormon and suggesting that they have been honoring
servants of Satan.
Yes.
Satanists.
Nicknames.
I literally got excommunicated for calling them Satanists. Like, literally, you could not make it up. The comedy is brilliant. I'm so happy. I was tone policed out of the church, but then Nelson has got up and actually literally said it himself. But it's okay for him.
And the Lord is supposed to be offended by nicknames. But in section 107 of the Doctrine and Covenants, the nickname for the holy priesthood after the order of the Son of God is the Melchizedek priesthood. It's a nickname. And it's a nickname to avoid the too often repetition of this name of the Supreme Being, who is the Son of God. Again, there's lots of clues in Mormon scripture to suggest that Jesus is not just the Son of God, he is the Supreme Being, which I think is important, because if the Supreme Being is willing to make himself equal to us, then that means that there's a possibility that in his resurrection, we have a real good chance of becoming eventually equal to God. And he's creating gods. That's theosis. That's the whole point of the gospel, is the creation of created divinities, although
and I'll just say, and I can only believe in that Mormon God. I can't believe in a God who is genuinely parental in a literal way rather than metaphorically, vaguely, the unmoved mover, but a real parental God. What do parents do? We want the best for our children. There's no way we would want our children to have less than us. We want them to have more than us. And with that comes the other idea I love that's biblical, where Jesus says, if you've done it unto the least of these, my brethren, you've done it unto me. That because of his great empathy and parentalness, God feels it. If you go and help a poor person or anyone in need, in whatever their need is, God feels that as if it's him. Because we'd all much rather people are nice to our children than to us, given the choice. That means more to us even. And in that sense, you can thank God for his atonement. You can genuinely pay him back. And he's told us all along how. He said, pass it on. Love each other. That's how you know you're a Christian. Show love to each other. Look after the poor and the outcasts. Go and look after the lost sheep, the people who've been rejected by society. And I will feel that as if it's me. And perhaps it's significant that Joseph Smith's last hours, if we're to believe the accounts, where he's having them sing a poor wayfaring man of grief, which is effectively that as a song. It's talking about someone in disguise who's actually Christ, and you're helping them, and then he reveals himself. That was something meaningful and deep for Joseph Smith in at the end. So I just wanted to say that, in my celebration of the Mormon divinity being, that idea of him wanting the best for us. But anyway, carry on. Sorry, I've derailed a bit.
No, I think we're going to get back to the church, the community that is of believers in Christ will undoubtedly have mystics, prophets, priests, and managers. They all necessary. Mystics to see into the other world and to try to relate it as well as they can, which is almost impossible to do. That's where they resort to all kinds of literary tropes to carry that through. And they confuse us, those literary tropes, because we reify them and try to make them real when really they're just trying to help us see something that is very hard to understand and see. Prophets, yes, not to prophesy the future, but to basically take up the cause of the widow and the orphan and the poor and the people who are downtrodden. And like the Old Testament prophets were fired up with indignation at the
social injustices
that took place in ancient Israel. And we need prophets to do that. And we need priests to guard the rituals, to make sure that they they're not used to become icons of and weaponized and icons for trouble, but they remain spiritual in their nature and they become accessible to everyone. That we don't have temple recommend questions. The early Mormons didn't have to pass temple recommend questions to go to the temple. And neither should we. Should be open to everyone and let God sort it out. And then lastly, we do need managers. There is a temporal reality to the church. And having, money is not in itself bad, but hoarding money when people are in need, or asking the members to continue to tithe when tithing is no longer necessary, or that they should pay for their children's missions when that's no longer necessary, or to clean the chapels when there are people that need the work to do that. That's wrong. And it's bad management is not what we need. We need Christian management. And it's in the Doctrine and Covenants, the law of consecration and stewardship, which doesn't work in its agrarian form anymore, but which could be updated to a post-industrial form of an insurance program where people pay tithing, but let's say 90% of the tithing goes as a premium to this insurance program that covers everybody against catastrophic illness and loss of jobs and divorce. People divorce, or one of the spouses dies, and the person that's left needs money. An insurance program could be created with the hundreds of billions of dollars that the church has, and instead of going around the world building steepled temples in small towns and aggravating the local residents of the town, they could come up with better use of the money. And this is not my field. I was a bankruptcy lawyer, so I know how things can collapse. But I'm not a mergers and acquisitions or a builder of wealth lawyer, so I don't know how that's done. But there are actuaries and others who do know how this could be done, and they could cover a lot of people with the money that they've got, in the sense of an ongoing insurance program. That could be the updated version of the law of consecration and
Well,
stewardship.
this is the inspired imagination, having the first clue what to do with your opportunities and
Right,
assets, and they
right.
clearly don't.
Yeah,
I've
they
said
don't have
that
an imagination, because
you
what
could
they're tied.
just put a primary class in a room, give them the budget, they'd come up with Jesus-y stuff to do with all of it. They could spend all that money sensibly and Christianly, and that should be as obvious to the apostles, yet somehow it isn't, which
Yeah,
raises these
and
questions
they
about
could create a
leadership. Yeah.
giant trust. They don't have to give up the
Mm.
money, but it could be used to fund a huge amount of people without really losing the benefit of the corpus of the trust. And
Which
so,
is what the Perpetual Education Fund was meant to be. They promised they were actually, you're not talking fantasy here, Paul. That Hinckley literally came up with that as the alleged concept for the Perpetual Education Fund, but it was so utterly mismanaged, and they made the people who, after being interrogated in order to have small loans to get them through education, they had to pay it back with interest. But not if you're a white middle class student at BYU and BYU Idaho. You don't have to pay any of that back. We'll just give you the money if you're already rich. But if you're dirt poor and desperate in a developing country, we will make you beg for it, and then we'll make you pay it back with interest. You can't even, these people haven't the first Christian bone in their bodies. I think, you're trying to be nice to them, but judge them by what they do. It's just in front of all of our faces. Their utter incompetence with managing the assets in a Christian way, as you say. But then the cruelty they inflict on the poor they're meant to be helping when they try to do something and then they mismanage it. So you're talking of your list is like visionaries, mystics, prophets, whatever. Mine is incompetence, nepotism,
well,
and avarice.
I'm not
Those are
I'm
the
not
key
saying that you're
indicators
not
of a
right. I
Mormon
mean,
leadership now.
I agree that you're
Yeah.
right. I'm not saying that the LDS
Yeah.
Church has mystics, prophets, priests, and managers. It's just that the
Yeah. But
Mormon
it needs them.
texts are not
Yeah.
inconsistent with the idea that we
Yeah.
should have mystics to tell us all the woo stuff, and
Yeah.
prophets
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
remind us of our civil liberties and rights, and priests to guard our rituals so
Speak
they don't
truth to
go out of
power.
control, and managers to
Yeah.
manage the money in a way that it is in accord with the Christian gospel of love. But we don't have that,
It shouldn't be this hard. It shouldn't be this hard, though. Why is it so hard when it's so
because
obvious
the
and
reason why it's
we were
hard.
taught in primary how?
I,
We were
I
taught in primary what it looks like.
I've got
Yeah.
to stop
Sorry.
talking over you. But the
No, no, no.
reason
It's my fault. We have a slight time delay. I
I
annoy all
didn't
my Brit
realize that I
Avenger
would shut
friends.
up when
Yeah,
you're talking.
yeah, yeah. No, sorry. It's my fault. I've got a weird time delay that happens, so I end up sounding like we're all talking over each other. So I apologize. It's not
The,
intentional.
the reason why we have the problems that we do in Mormonism is because in the apostolic quorums of the first presidency and the quorum of the 12, they have a seniority concept. And because of the seniority concept, you're not allowed to contradict your leader. You have to follow your leader. So if your leader, like Brigham Young, was racist, the next guy, who may not have been racist, bears the burden of continuing to sustain Brigham Young as a prophet, seer, and revelator. But what do you do about his racism? You can't throw it under the bus. So you're stuck, and that guy doesn't want to contradict the racism. So the racism persists, the misogyny persists, eventually the elitism persists. Then you get down into the homophobia begins to persist. And finally, you get a guy like Russell M. Nelson, who decides that he's not going to be bound by what the other guys said before him. But instead of going in the right direction, he goes into another wrong direction by throwing the word Mormon and under the he objects to Mormon, the word Mormon, or he objects to
language control,
or he objects to give me a break. I'm old now and I have trouble with nouns. Tattoos or body piercings, or Boyd Packer didn't like any rock music except of all people Barry Manilow. He liked Barry Manilow for some reason. It's just absolutely hilarious. Or you have,
and probably Liberace.
No, he didn't like Liberace. He wasn't that cool. He liked Barry Manilow. And I know what you mean by Liberace, though. I get the point.
With his alleged suppressed self-loathing homosexuality.
Yeah, that kind of thing. And so you have these people who are bad mystics, bad prophets, bad priests, and bad managers, because they have separated the power of the priesthood from the rights of the priesthood. They have done the very thing that the 121st section, which alone would prove Joseph Smith was a prophet. That revelation.
I agree. That I've said
shown,
often.
because he, they people who hate Joseph Smith attribute to him many bad things, but I don't think that a narcissist, a dedicated narcissist, a dedicated evil person could ever have come up with that section of the 121st section.
Let me propose a third way. There are lots of people who've come up with wisdom in a moment of epiphany in a dungeon, who, when they've stepped out back into access to power and other people's wives, have kind of forgotten that moment of truth. So I think you can do both. There's
all right,
lots of examples
I grant you that.
I
exceed your point. It's just hard for me to understand how Joseph Smith could have done the Book of Mormon and done the temple ritual and done the translation of the Bible and done the Book of Abraham, regardless of their historical provenance, and spoken in all these different voices of theology that was really quite unique. And that, if not unique, it was certainly not orthodox. It wasn't Orthodox Christianity. It's hard for me to believe, but it's possible that he could have. Certainly he could have it as bad moments. I think you could have.
Can I tell you how? I find it hard to believe, but it's in front of all our faces, that fourth, fifth generation Latter-day Saints who grew up with the whole curriculum, reading the Bible, studying the Sermon on the Mount, being taught it in seminary and institute, or whatever their equivalent was back in the day, who've given talks about the core values of Christianity, can then become our current first presidency and apostles and throw it all down the toilet, and most of the membership with it. So something happens. It does happen. 10-year-old Russell M. Nelson would not be doing half the stuff he does now, because 10-year-old Russell M. Nelson would have still been a Christian who got it. But what is it that happens? And I guess the easy answer is power corrupts. Power, wealth, status, adulation, pride, all the things they've literally given talks against, but then are obviously doing themselves. And this is part of the tragedy. You can't trust anyone with that much power. And the scriptures are replete with examples. As I said, Samuel warning them not to have kings because it will ruin their whole nation. The Book of Mormon teaches this. If they had ears to hear, they'd have heard it all and been very careful about themselves as they approached positions of power to not make the mistakes and do the forbidden things. But they make the mistakes and they do the forbidden things. And Doctrine and Covenants warned them that they would, and yet they did it anyway. So I do just think, sadly, that it's maddening, because they have had their great moments. When Dallin Oaks, my now nemesis, started out, he seemed to be the sharpest tool in the box. he was saying intellectually interesting, Christ-focused, forward-thinking stuff in his early talks as a general authority. He was on the board of Dialogue, magazine. He was quite liberal and woke, you'd think, but very quickly he spiraled as soon as he got power. He was put into power as an apostle, and one of his first jobs was to prepare the church's crusade against LGBTQ rights, and he's been on that job ever since. So, which kind of brings me back to, you can't give people these leadership roles without a massive amount of caveats, being able to remove them from power the second they step out of line, without the common consent democracy systems that you have to stay sane and stable and righteous as a leader. And it's just so obvious from what is in the Doctrine and Covenants of the Book of Mormon in particular about that. I think the New Testament is interesting because, and the Book of Mormon, I think, is a valuable counterpoint and companion, because the New Testament describes a people who don't have political power, who are oppressed, colonized people at the mercy of the Romans. So the messaging in the New Testament tends more towards the personal and the individual, and not how you organize government, because they didn't have any power over government. You were just in the Roman Empire. Even Paul was living within that system. Whereas the Book of Mormon gets into the politics. You have the New Testament messages about how to live personally, but there's a huge political dimension to it. How do you do righteous war? And it's got just war theory, which is one of the philosophies, and it offers both. You can do defensive armed militarism if it's needed, but you can also be a pacifist, and the one should protect the other. I mean, that's an extraordinary contribution the Book of Mormon makes to the ethics of warfare, that you can be a conscientious objector, and that's just as valid as being a righteous warrior defending your people.
Yeah.
They're not, it doesn't teach that one is better than the other. It teaches them both as virtuous, which I think is an extraordinary forward-thinking thing to include among others. That's one of my pluses for the Book of Mormon. But I don't know where I started there. I'm having a stupor of thought, Paul. I'm on one of mine, but ultimately, my point here is that we can only really have our mystics and our prophets and so on without them also becoming monsters in almost every case.
Yeah.
If you have the checks and balances on power that
Yeah.
the scriptures teach, and that the Doctrine and Covenants lays out as the constitution for our church, they should do nothing. They should authorize nothing, not even policies, without it being first checked with the whole membership. And every time I've brought this up and banged my head against that wall with people in local leadership and all the rest of it, it worries me, because that idea of accountability was so drilled into us in the 70s and 80s. They've lost it now. It's been brainwashed out of their minds. They don't even care about it, to the point where, when I keep saying why, as a concrete example, why are our first presidencies appointing themselves in secret and setting apart the new first presidency without a vote of the people, they kind of say, well, it doesn't really matter. I'm like, are you kidding me? We wouldn't ordain a bishop without a vote of the people. You can't do that. But then they've got this little sneaky caveat in the General Handbook, which says that elders can be ordained without a vote of the stake, but you can then sustain them retrospectively at your next conference. And I don't see what the difference is that for any other calling. Why do they get an exception? But they've normalized that exception, and then people quickly use that as an excuse for them. Oh yeah, well, the elders we can ordain, we can sustain after the event of their ordination. Therefore, it's okay to do that with the first presidency. And you start to think, is this accidental or intentional? Because they are, as you have established, utterly thick as two planks. But if they were being sneaky, that's a quite clever way to introduce, in just one case of ordination, your precedent that you can then have your little apologists trot out as the excuse for not voting about first presidencies before they're ordained. So they've established these precedents and systems, and they just do it of no accountability, no sustaining vote before they choose, set apart the actual prophet and president of the church, at the same time as teaching that um, common consent's essential. But it misses the point because it's meant to be safeguarding. You're meant to be able to say before you lay hands on them if they're not suitable or if you don't agree to them being in power. Um, so we are the victims and they are the victims. I think a theme that's coming through here is even with the best will in the world, none of them are going to survive this system of abuse of power. They're fed into a machine that inevitably makes them what they are. Doctrine and Covenants 121 says they're going to be corrupt if they're given that much power. It's inevitable. And they are all victims of that system in how they ascended through the ranks without the skill set to actually be religious leaders. Do you think, and I mean, they've certainly got, well, you could say they've got the skill set to be managers, but I don't think they even do that very well. They make really dumb decisions and they take far too long to make any of them, so I don't think they're good managers. They may be good liars, but do you think
They're
any
trapped.
of the, yeah,
They're
can
trapped
they
in
be
a
prophets and mystics?
they're trapped in a system where they have to
Hmm.
sustain the errors of their former leaders.
Yeah.
And they can't break away, and when they do break away, they make things worse
Mm.
because they don't understand the gospel.
Yeah.
They confuse the plan of salvation with the journey of the soul. They
Mm.
have many confusing things that they're confused about.
Mm.
They try to shy away from the trivialities of our theology and miss the deep themes of Mormonism.
Okay, so our theme here has been about leadership, mystics, prophets, or managers. We've established that it would help to have accountability and more consultation with the members and common consent democracy and so on. Um, and one of the things that I mentioned really turned me on to your perspective on things, where you were talking about how significant education and profession and qualifications is. That Hugh Nibley's point was managers and lawyers are exactly the wrong people to be in leadership of a religion for the given reasons. And your point was you need a liberal arts education. And that's kind of an American phrase, but by liberal arts, it means literature, history, art, theology, philosophy, the actual stuff of religion. And you were pointing out that an MBA, a business management degree, and other people have commented on this a lot as well, is very kind of an odd one. It doesn't involve usually researching anything deep and thoughtful. It's kind of about controlling people in effect as a major priority and making a profit. And being a lawyer is about careful lying on behalf of a biased client. Um, so, what would you, if you were going to describe sort of the life path or education of an ideal apostle for the LDS Church? Just to finish up, offering we've done our criticism, offering the actual practical pathway to having the right kind of leader. What would you consider as the kind of person they should be putting into leadership? Or if you were going to design an educational path for a future apostle of the church for it to be done right, what would you recommend as the stepping stones to make that person where we can control education and life experience?
Well, the person
Nothing
I would
heavy.
pick as a model,
Yeah.
the person I would pick as a model would be
Mm.
Howard W. Hunter.
Okay.
Uh, he kind of grew up with a parent. One parent was Mormon, maybe not a good one, and another one was non-Mormon in
Mm.
California. He was in a
Mm.
jazz band when he was a kid, and
Mm.
he became a state president in California back when Mormonism was really heating up down there.
Mm.
And then he was surprisingly called to the Council of the 12, and he had no connections to the royal families of Mormonism, and
Mm.
he was
Mm.
never a Smith or a Richards or a
Mm.
McConkie or a Red or any of these people, like Mitt Romney or anything like
Mm.
that. He was, he was just So I think he was a good model.
What was his education? Do you know
He was a
what was
lawyer.
his sort of career? Okay,
He was.
some of them
I
can
think
be
he had
good.
a solo practice in California. I don't think being a
Mm,
lawyer disqualifies you, and disqualifies
yeah.
you and anybody else. I mean,
Mm,
I think
mm,
what disqualifies you is if you just are elitist and you don't want to answer
mm,
questions and you don't think anybody has a right to argue with you and take
mm,
issue with what you believe, and you think that everything that comes into your head is the word of God. That's what
yeah.
makes you an awful person. It's narcissism, or this being
Mm,
sanctimonious, or not being able to have a sense of humor. One time
mm.
on Gospel Tangents with Rick Bennett, I once said, I don't know why the leaders of the church are against body piercings. Jesus had body piercings, and and Rick Bennett just
And he's
gasped.
kept them.
And I said, well, come on. I mean, Jesus doesn't
Yeah,
Jesus had to have a sense of humor. I mean, look who
yeah,
he's dealing with, us. And he did have a
yeah,
sense of humor, and so
yeah,
some of his
yeah,
sarcasm we don't get out of the New
mm,
Testament because we don't
yeah,
ascribe sarcasm to the Lord. But I can tell you,
yeah. No, it's
in my
definitely there.
encounters with the Lord, he's full of sarcasm. In fact, I wrote a
Yeah.
novel called Driving Jesus, in which old Paul is driving across country with Jesus, and we're just having these discussions where he's extremely funny and sarcastic because
Mm,
he loves us. And sarcasm is a way of distancing yourself from pain sometimes. I mean,
yeah, yeah.
and so
It's
I think that a good Mormon
laughter is the
apostle
best
would have all
medicine.
of those features and not be
Mm,
inclined to always be trying to say that their
mm,
leaders were infallible. Trying to prove that your leaders are infallible
mm,
leads you into more and more error.
mm.
You can't do that.
And can I share? Yeah, and my lived experience with of that is I agree. Howard W. Hunter was one of our shortest serving prophets, but he came and spoke at the Royal Albert Hall in London. We filled it with all the Mormons in the region, which you probably couldn't do today. And we were so used to, and most of that meeting was absolute dreck. Usually, when apostles come here, they reminisce about their missions in the British mission or Europe and their British ancestors. And the women go, "Aren't you lucky to be here at the feet of the prophets today?" And then the prophets get up and they just do their travelogue stories, and they don't bring any meat. And it used to drive my mum absolutely nuts that she was a public affairs officer for the church. We make all that effort to traipse into London, and they don't give us anything of substance. And they're still mostly doing the same with a few rare exceptions. But Howard W. Hunter got up and he gave just the simplest message that has always stuck with me since. He was talking about how if we keep worrying about our past sins and feeling guilty for them, it's like when you're plowing a furrow in a field. If you keep looking backwards with your tractor and plow, your furrow will go wobbly. Your future gets messed up. But if you just face forward and stop looking backwards with guilt, you can plow a straight furrow and move on into the future. And for a young, can't remember how old I was at the time, but a young, older teenager, I think probably, who'd been through the machine of guilt about having puberty and everything else they could think of,
Mm-hmm.
without the adult perspective to ignore the idiots giving you guilt trips about literally everything. You took it all very seriously. That to me was manna from heaven. That was what I needed to hear from my prophet, is to stop having the guilt trips and look forward. Move on, believe Jesus that it's dealt with, and you can go on. So I absolutely agree with you. There was something different and special about him, and it's such a shame he wasn't around for that long. That's the kind of leader we need. Yeah.
And so,
Mm,
yeah, I think that Howard Hunter was a very Christian man. In fact, my friend wrote a letter to him just shortly after I was excommunicated and said, and my friend wasn't talking about me. He wrote a letter to Howard Hunter
mm,
because Howard had given a very nice Christian talk. And my friend Fred wrote him a letter and said, I really loved your talk. And then Howard's secretary called Fred and said, I'd like to talk to you. Could you come up to my office? This is just
wow.
before he was made president of the church.
Mm,
And I think, I forget when it was. And so Fred goes up there, not knowing. The secretary tells Fred, don't spend more than 10 minutes with him because, so Fred goes in there looking at his watch, and Howard Hunter has not been told by the secretary that they have only 10 minutes. So he's talking to Fred, and the time has gone by, and Fred's nervous that the secretary is going to come in and drag him out, but
turn him off.
That didn't happen. And they talk about, Fred's family and all of that. And then Fred gets up to leave because he's very nervous about getting out of there and not wanting to overstay his time. And Howard Hunter reaches out and grabs Fred by the hand in a double hand clasp and holds it there. And Fred told me, he said he held it there for, it must have been a minute. I mean, I was so nervous. And he was just sitting there silently holding my hand. And then he says, out of the blue, tell Brother Toscano that we think highly of him.
Oh.
And we will make amends.
Wow. Whoa.
And so when Howard Hunter became president, he held a press conference in the lobby of 47 East South Temple Street. And he was sitting at the table with his counselors. And next to him, like a jury box, were the 12 apostles. And when the camera focused on him, he was giving his speech. In the middle of his speech, I think the camera panned the faces of the 12 apostles. And Howard was saying that he knew that people had been hurt by things in the church and that there have been people who'd been damaged, and he was going to try to make amends, and they would try to, reach out to these people and bring them back in. At the time he was saying that, the camera showed the faces of the 12 apostles panning across their faces, and they looked like they had been told there was no cure for hemorrhoids. I mean, they had such expressions on their face. And Lavina Anderson, who was one of the September 6 who died last year in October, in 2023, she compiled, and you can find this online, she compiled a history of Howard Hunter's speech and how over the next months and after he died, that speech was altered by the church to make it less and less welcoming back over time, until it became just a harsh message that now when I appealed my excommunication in 1993, and I couldn't appeal it to the first presidents because Ezra Benson was comatose. And I couldn't appeal it to the first presidency in the Quorum of the 12, which is the apostolic interregnum, because Dallin Oaks had lied about my excommunication to Steve Benson and to the Arizona Republic, Paul Brinkley Rogers, who he'd lied to, and
which I've covered in the podcast.
And he had lied about it. But Boyd Packer was, right up there at the top, next to being president, very close.
He was president of the 12,
acting president of
or
the
acting
12.
president,
And so my appeal to them was an appeal to a body that had been contaminated by bias. So I appealed to the General Assembly of the Church, which is the same body that sustains the first presidency as supposed to, because that was the body that excommunicated Oliver Cowdery, and that was the body that could excommunicate the president of the church, a bishop and 12 counselors, but it had to go to the General Assembly of the church. Now, you're better at this, and I can't remember where the scriptures are that sustain this idea, but the idea is that you canonize Revelation before the constituent body of the church, and you install people, but also it's a judicial body, and I appeal to them saying, look, there is no, I'm going to have to appeal to a higher body. Well, in December of 1993, Kerry Hines, who was my state president, came to my house and gave me the letter that was the decision on appeal. and they weren't going to send it to, obviously they were going to send it to the General Assembly because they wouldn't want me making a case before the General Assembly.
Yeah.
But, and, you know, Ezra Benson wasn't functioning. So it was signed by, I think it was Gordon Hinckley.
Thomas Monson.
Yes, Gordon Hinckley and Thomas Monson.
Hinckley and Monson basically did an apostolic coup and were running
they were the
church and
counselors,
faking
and Howard
Benson's
Hunter
signature.
Howard Hunter was the president of the Council of the 12, and Boyd Packer was after Howard Hunter. Okay. And so Howard Hunter wasn't the acting president; he was the actual president of the Council of the 12. The two counselors came after Howard Hunter, but Howard Hunter was not well, and so he wasn't in the first presidency. And so, he came. Kerry Hines, my stake president, came to my house. He wouldn't let me read the letter. He wouldn't let me touch the letter. He only would allow himself to read the letter to me. And I remember,
and that's basically what happened to me. I can't remember if my stake president physically handed it to me. I've joked with Nemo, who's waiting for his appeal verdict, that with retrospect, I should have just grabbed the letter and run. So I've told him to do that.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
But I think
won't let you touch it. They won't let you release it.
You're not allowed to have the evidence.
Yeah. And so I said to Kerry, I said, look, do you believe that your excommunication nullifies my faith, repentance, baptism, and the gift of the Holy Ghost, nullifies my temple ordinances, my priesthood, my marriage to Margaret, and my sealings to my children? And he said, yes, absolutely. And I said, then why don't you just kill me? Because you've taken away my eternal life. You're willing to take away my eternal life and leave me with just my mortal life? That's what you think you have the power to do? And I remember Mike Quinn, was excommunicated as one of the September 6th. I was speaking with him on some occasion a long time ago, and he said, I really don't believe that the Holy Spirit of promise has ratified my excommunication, since it was connived by Boyd Packer.
I agree. I feel the same way.
That
that's how I view mine.
I don't know how old you are. Are you approaching 50? Probably.
I'm 53. Thank you. That's very kind of you.
You're approaching 53. It from the wrong direction. And as Dame Edna once said. And I think that, being 80, or I'll be 80 in May of 2025. I mean, I've had a long history in the church. I can tell you stories about my personal conference with Harold B. Lee, or my personal conference with Neil Maxwell, or the time I talked to Marion Romney, or how my wife's sister, youngest sister, who's dead now, was married to John Dyer, whose grandfather was LeGrand Richards, and how LeGrand Richards showed up at our wedding reception. And I went to their house one time and spent a few hours talking to him. I told you about L. Tom Perry. I used to have a lot of communication with leaders of the church. I knew Hartman Rector very, very well. I used to argue with him about his his opinions that I thought were wrong. And while he was with me, he would change his views. But as soon as he was back with his brethren, he would snap back like an overstretched rubber band. I was very good friends with his family. I knew him. He released me from my mission in Italy. And I've spent, he was a very lovely person in private, but he gave very harsh speeches because that was what he believed was required of him. Just like Spencer Kimball believed that a miracle of forgiveness was required of him, because they have an obedience, legalistic view of the gospel rather than a love view of the gospel, because that was what was passed down to them. And that they feel that's the aspect of Mormonism they're supposed to protect and preserve, but it's not. No. So, it was an interesting life. I wish I could remember all of it.
I don't remember half of mine. You're doing very well, Paul. I really appreciate those thoughts, and I think they're perfect for kind of concluding the leadership episode. Because you're speaking to how they function, that difference between their private lives and their public persona, how the few people who have been able to get them in a room and thrash out doctrinal ideas with them have in a way been persuasive, and it shows how much they could be moderated and made more healthy if that was formalized as a process of consultation and common consent with the whole membership. It's a small glimmer of what could have been to help them avoid making so many of their mistakes. They need us. They need our help to not make errors. They need our help to really meet the needs of the people. They're put in an impossible situation, I think we all agree, in a system that's not the one that God actually established in the revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants. So of course it's not going to work. It's ultimately rapidly becomes Lucifer's plan, and they teach it, and it's in an inevitable consequence of not getting the basics right ethically and organizationally, and the system has to change somehow. And we have to be, in a sense, the people need to rise up and be the leaders. And if they don't, their wards will disappear, and their children will continue to leave the church at rates of 80% by the time they're age 25. And 2/3 now, I think, of return missionaries are leaving pretty quickly, is the latest stats being thrown around. I don't know how accurate that is globally, but it's spot on accurate for our local experience here for years. That's been how many have left very quickly. Everyone is suffering because of these failures of leadership and the leadership system of the church. And it does all boil down to that, as you've been saying. So thank you for your thoughts on that. Brilliant topic. Please join us tomorrow. We'll have our next one, which is going to be all about Joseph Smith, good or evil. Which is you're saying it'll be a short discussion. I don't know. Let's find out. It might drag on a bit more. So thank you again, Paul Toscano, for sharing your thoughts with us and spending this time. And we'll see you all next episode.
All right.